The topic is about warping and warp modes and how to use and abuse them in different ways. So regardless of the genre you make, I hope you walk away from today with some techniques that you can kind of experiment with and get some fun sounds out of. Warping, if you're brand new to Ableton Live, you might not know exactly what it is. Although, for most of you guys that I've met, you've at least dabbled in Ableton a little bit before coming here. So everyone has like a little bit of an idea of what warping is. Can somebody tell me, like in your own words, what is warping audio to you? Feel free to.
Warping audio is when you time stretch it from its original tempo. Could also include
Yeah.
uh, different warping algorithms if you're using Ableton for different types of audio.
Yes, sir. Those are all facts. Anybody else want to add to the definition here? What do you know about warping? If you've ever done it before, or if you've heard through the grapevine what it is. Who in here has warped audio before or added warp markers to something and tried to move it around? I would imagine most of you have at least dabbled with it, right? Well, if we had to really boil it down, the real definition of warping is taking a recorded audio file, piece of audio, and locking it onto a grid. Everything you said, Mr. Slinton, is stuff that you can do once audio is warped. Yeah, you can time stretch it. You can play with the different warp algorithms, which is what we're going to do today to kind of like make things sound different. You can kind of chop things up in certain ways. You can pitch them up and down, right? In the days before digital audio, when the only recorded audio media that we had were things like vinyl records, tapes, cassettes, right? Pitch and playback time were inherently linked to each other. Have any of you ever played a record off of a turntable or played a tape off of a tape deck? Hopefully someone in here is old enough to have done that at least once. It's weird because it's getting like fewer and fewer people every couple of years. But for those of you who nodded your heads, like if I have a vinyl record on a turntable and there's like a pitch slider on the turntable, if I pitch it up, what happens to the playback speed of the record?
You pitch up a record,
Pitch a record up,
it speeds up,
speeds up, exactly.
and the
Yeah, yeah.
pitch goes up too. Yeah.
And the pitch goes up. Yeah. So in order to, like, if I'm DJing with vinyl records, if I need to change the tempo of a song to get it to match so I could beat match another record that's playing, I need to pitch it up. So pitch and playback speed are always related. If you've ever played a tape off of a tape deck and you've hit the fast forward button, if you can still hear the audio coming through the speakers, it sounds like Alvin and the Chipmunks or something. It's like, really high pitched, fast voice, because as we're fast forwarding through the tape, we hear this really high pitched version of it as it plays back. So like pitch and playback time were always kind of related. With digital audio, we started to break the boundaries there a little bit. We could start to change the pitch of something without having to adjust its playback speed, or vice versa. We could time stretch audio without having to adjust its pitch. And that's really what warping is. Warping allows us to change pitch or playback speed of an audio file independently. There is one warp mode called repitch. In fact, why don't I just let's share my screen already here. There is a warp mode called repitch, which kind of harkens back to the old days of analog audio, of where like pitch and playback speed and pitch and time were sort of like linked to each other, and you couldn't get away from that. But that can still be a cool creative warp mode, as I'll hopefully demonstrate before the end here. Okay, share sound stereo. Okay, cool. So I just like started throwing together a session right before this where I'm just like throwing some loops in here. Let's make sure everyone can hear this. Going out to Zoom here. Let's make sure my sound ID thing is turned off. Okay. Can you all hear that? Okay, great. See some heads nodding. Okay, so I was just kind of digging through some loops here. And if you're going through sample packs like this and you're looking for loops, for the most part, Ableton Live is going to automatically warp things for you. A lot of times you don't even have to think about it, right? The reason for that is because if we go to the preferences or the settings in Ableton, remember Command comma or Control comma will take us there, and we go to the Record Warp Launch tab over here, you'll see that there's this section here under Warp/Fades. It says Loop Warp Short Samples, and the default setting here is set to Auto. And I would say that's a pretty good setting to leave it on. If you look at some of these different options here, if we turn it off of Auto, these are the other options we have. But essentially what this is telling Ableton Live is when we bring a short sample in, and I'm not sure what exactly the cutoff in terms of the length of a sample is for short versus long. I think it's probably like 30 seconds or less or something like that. But if Ableton Live detects that it's a shorter audio file, so for example, maybe not a full song or like not a full stem, that's like the length of a whole song, then it's going to analyze what the audio is, and it will make a decision of whether or not it needs to warp it. And if we bring it in, for example, to the session view, like I have here, whether or not it needs to turn the loop function on or off. So before I kind of go through these really quickly, let's just look at this loop. This is just a loop I dragged in from my sample library. And if we look at some of the settings here, we can see down here in the clip parameters off to the left, we can see that it is warped. And we can also see that this loop button is turned on. I think I did add, it looks like I added a couple warp markers here and moved some things around. But when I dragged it in, it had warp turned on and it was pretty closely warped. I just kind of tightened up these snares here a little bit. But it also turned loop on because it detected that this is a drum loop. And so therefore, I'm going to just turn loop on for you and set up this loop brace, which can be adjusted in the top of the clip here. So this is an orange colored clip. So my loop brace, if I click away from it, is also orange. So it kind of automatically set that all up for me. So it detected all that. And I didn't really have to do much work here. The only thing I did was add a couple of warp markers just to kind of tighten it up, right? But warp was turned on, it had loop on, and I could just drop it in here and hit play on it, and it would just loop forever, right? Okay, so that's because my loop warp short sample setting is set to auto, and Ableton detected all that stuff for me. But the other options you have here are unwarped one shot. What that means is that when I drag any audio file in, a loop or like a one shot, like a kick drum sample or something like that, it means Ableton will just leave it alone. It's not going to turn any sort of loop brace on. It's not going to try to warp it for me automatically. It's just going to play it back as it was recorded. And if I want to loop it, I need to warp it myself. And if I'm playing it in session view, I got to turn this loop button on here. Okay. So it's just going to leave it alone. Basically, that's going to be the least, like the most laissez-faire, the most like hands-off way that Ableton Live is going to treat your audio. We also have warped one shot. That means that Ableton will detect it if it's, if it's something that needs to be warped or, is a loop that's meant to play over a certain amount of time, 4 bars or whatever. It will automatically warp it for you, but it will not turn the loop function on. It'll just leave it as a one shot. And then warped loop means any audio you bring in, whether it is intended to be a loop or whether it is intended to be a one shot, just like a single sample, like a kick or a snare or whatever, it's going to both warp it for you and set up a loop. It's going to kind of estimate how long it thinks that sample should play for, and it's going to set up a loop, right? So it's, it's a lot of things to consider here. And so auto is nice because it does most of the heavy lifting for you. It does a lot of the hard thinking for you. And like I would say 99% of the time it nails it. Like if I bring in a one shot, it recognizes that, it leaves it alone. If I bring in a loop, it recognizes that, it warps it for me, and it turns loop on. So I don't have to do a whole lot of work. So I would recommend leaving that on. But if you're in a situation, maybe you're in a situation where you're, I don't know, you're making a sample pack or something like that. And when you're rendering samples, you don't always want it to warp it for you and do all this stuff. You just want to kind of leave them alone. Maybe you'll change it in certain contexts. But I would say for the most part, when you're like producing music, you can leave this on auto and you're fine. Another setting here, while I'm here, it's worth mentioning this auto warp long sample setting. So a long sample, again, I don't know the exact cutoff point here, but a long sample is going to be something like a full song. Maybe you're doing a DJ set or something like that. Or like I said earlier, stems, if you're doing a remix or something and you got a bunch of stems from an artist that are like the full length of the song. So a vocal stem that's like 3 minutes long or whatever, and a bass stem and drum stem, whatever. I would say leave this off if it is on. I know the default setting is to have that on. Leave this off because most long samples have a little bit of space at the beginning. And Ableton Live will kind of factor that in and think, oh, this is where the audio file should start from, right? And then like the rest of the song or the rest of the stem is like going to be totally off. So you're always going to have to get in there and sort of place warp markers and realign the one, like where the downbeat is, on your own. So this just removes a bit of headache for you. It just allows you to get in and do it on your own rather than Ableton messing it up and then you going in and having to just like correct it. So I would recommend leaving that off. And then I guess we'll also mention this too, the default warp mode. The default warp mode is set to beats mode. I know some of you have probably changed it to complex. If you don't know what these warp modes are before the end of today, you will. And if you want to change this to something different, you can absolutely do that. I left mine on beats mode because I think for most of the stuff that I'm doing, beats is generally fine. And I kind of like how I can use it to tighten up drum loops and things like that. So I'll show you what I mean by that. Okay, so that's just, again, kind of the recap here, the ground rules. So warping is aligning audio to a grid and kind of locking it onto a grid. Once it's locked onto a grid, we can adjust the pitch or we can adjust the playback speed. We can do that either up here with like our project tempo up here. So if I play this back and I turn maybe I turn this down, maybe I'm turning more like a, I don't know, lo-fi breaks or something like that. I've changed my tempo, and if I play the metronome, which always plays in time with my tempo, we can hear that it's playing perfectly in time. That drum beat is playing perfectly in time with my tempo, regardless of how I change it here, because it is properly warped. Let me go back to my original tempo, which is 170, I think, yeah. And if I change the pitch, the playback speed is not affected, right? If I bring this into, let's bring it into the arrangement view here and just take a look at it, right? So when I have a sample that's warped, I bring it in, this is a 1 bar long loop and it's just locking exactly to 1 bar, right? Regardless of how I change the tempo, it's always gonna be locked to that 1 bar. But check it out, if I turn warp off, look what happens if I change my tempo. Let me turn off my loop brace. See how it kind of moves in relationship to the grid? Right? So when audio is not warped and we adjust the tempo of our project, we actually see it in relation to the grid. It's not locked onto that grid anymore. It's independent of the grid. So we can kind of see the length of it looks like it's longer or shorter based on the grid. In reality, the tempo is always the same for this loop, but my project tempo is different. So it's more so what's happening is like the grid in the background is actually changing, but visually it looks like the audio file is changing. Now this can be cool for certain creative purposes. Sometimes you just turn warp off if you want something to lock in a certain way, or maybe I want that snare to hit on bar number 2 or whatever. I play this with the metronome. And if we like loop, so I can create kind of like weird syncopated things like that, you know, that aren't perfectly in time. They're kind of like polymetric or whatever. In relation to my tempo, if something is not warped like that. But it is kind of interesting, you know, if we change the tempo, we see it change on the grid. But also check this out, if I go back to 170 BPM, if I go down here and I change the pitch, same thing happens, right? So if I'm pitching it up, I'm increasing the playback speed. It plays through that same loop faster. If I bring the pitch down, it takes longer to play through. Let me turn my loop brace off. Zoom controls are down here. Okay, so sometimes bringing an audio file in and turning warp off can be an interesting, just kind of sound design, creative way to make it sound different, right? Let's go back to my loop here in the session view for a moment. Okay, let's just kind of quickly talk through these warp modes. So we've established that warping audio means we're locking the audio onto a grid, right? Let me delete these warp markers that I've added here. Whoops. Get rid of that one. So warp markers are these little yellow squares, and we can add these anywhere on the top of an audio file. We have to do it down here in clip view. But if I just move my mouse to this sort of dark gray line above the waveform, I can double click anywhere I want and create a warp marker. You'll notice that there are these little gray triangles. When you bring an audio file in and Ableton Live analyzes it, it creates these little triangles. These are called transient markers. So it's kind of like detecting where transients are. Do we all know what a transient is? Anybody not know what a transient is? And feel free to ask questions or chime in if I'm going over your head with anything. I have no problem explaining things more if needed. But
Could
anyway, yeah,
you
so it's gone
define
through.
that?
Yeah, the transient is basically a peak in the waveform. Like right here, for example, there's like a sharp peak. That's generally indicated by like the beginning of a drum, like the, you know, the initial hit of a drum sample. Or if you got like maybe it's like a loop of a synth pluck or something like that, right? The beginnings of each note where you're going to hear like a sharp peak in the waveform, those are called transients. So it's gone through and detected those. And with something like a drum loop, that's good because you want to kind of find where those are. Now you see it did a pretty decent job, but it did skip a few. Like there's one right here that it probably could have detected. My point here, though, is that even though Ableton doesn't always nail where the transients are, a lot of people like that I've met that are new to Ableton Live think that, oh, I can only make a warp marker on top of a transient marker by just double clicking above it. And that's true. You can create warp markers like that, but you can, like I said, you can make warp markers anywhere you want to. If it's kind of snapping to the grid or it's not going in exactly where you want it to, if you right click on the waveform, make sure this adaptive grid setting is on. I like to use this adaptive grid narrow setting, especially when I'm working with audio files and adjusting warp settings. And then you can zoom in on the waveform. And let's say I want to add a warp marker like right here on that peak. I can do that. I can also right click and I can select, if I can find it on the menu here, insert transient. Yeah. And then just add a transient marker and just say like, I should probably move it over. Let's delete that one. I should probably move it like right here. Insert transient. Zoom in a little bit more. Yeah, like right there. Shift Command I will insert the transient, and then I'll delete this one, delete transient. So if you want to go in and manually add some, you can. But really all the transient markers are is literally that. They're just markers. They're just like marking off where it thinks a transient is. So to lock this to the grid and to allow us to now time stretch it or time compress it without changing the pitch or repitch it without changing the tempo, that's where these different warp modes come into play. So each of the different warp modes on the list here is it's a different algorithm or a different like approach that Ableton Live takes to time stretching the audio or repitching the audio. Like, how does it let us do this? So probably the one that you see most people on YouTube use all the time is complex. And complex is pretty good. Complex, if we set it, we don't have any additional controls. It just uses some pretty heavy math to allow you to time stretch audio or repitch audio without without changing the other thing, right? You can repitch without time stretching and time stretch without repitching. But it does this in a way where it uses a, dare I say, complex algorithm that just does both of these processes without doing anything really destructive to the audio file. Now it will, push it hard enough, it's going to start to add artifacts and you're going to get some weirdness in your audio file. But the rest of these modes are all going to chop up the audio in some way. And, you might think that's a bad thing, but that's where some of the creative fun of this can start to take place. So let's talk about beats mode for a minute. And you'll start to see with all these other ones, beats, tones, texture, even complex pro, we have some controls that we can mess around with. And like I said, this is where some of the creative fun is going to come into play here. So beats mode, let's talk about that. That is probably my favorite warp mode. I know a lot of people automatically, I'm going to switch to complex. But give beats mode a chance, especially if you're warping loops like this. The default settings on beats mode look like this. You got beats mode, you have preserve transients, you have this little left and right arrow thing, and then this slider at 100%. So what is all this stuff? Well, what beats mode does, in order to allow you to time stretch an audio file or repitch an audio file, what it does is it actually chops the audio file up. And where it chops it is determined by the preserve setting here, right? The preserve setting is currently transients. Transients means wherever we have these transient markers. So that's why, like I said earlier, you may want to add a transient marker if you noticed Ableton missed one somewhere. Like there's also one right here. I could potentially add a transient marker like right there, insert transient, right? So now when it's warping, it's going to create slices where we see all these little triangles, right? These little transient markers. Let's probably add one right here as well. There. Okay, so that's where it's going to slice things up. But we can tell it to slice things up on certain note divisions as well. We can slice it every bar, half note, eighth note, quarter note, 16th note, right? All these different versions here. And let's just start with transients for a minute and talk about what's going on. So I'm going to play this loop back, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to time stretch it. And to do that, I'm just going to, again, pull my tempo down here. So let's play it. And it's still playing perfectly in time, but if you listen to the audio quality of it, listen to what's going on. It starts to sound choppy. Kind of garbled, and the transients are a little wonky. If I really slow it down, sounds all like jiggly and weird. Okay, that could be cool depending on what you want from your drum loop or whatever it is you're warping. But odds are when you're really time stretching a drum loop like this and you start to slow things down or pitch things down, it's going to start to sound choppy and weird, and you may not like that. Now, again, the reason for that is because beats mode, in order to time stretch this audio, it's chopping the audio up, right? So you can imagine, like, you know, from here to here, where I have like from the first transient to the second, when I time stretch this, it's like I've taken scissors and I've cut right there and right there. So all these slices are kind of like split apart from each other, right? But if I play it back, I'm playing at 68 BPM. This is really slow. This original recording was probably like 160 something BPM, I think the original one. So I'm really slowing this down. It sounds choppy, but I'm not hearing gaps between those different slices like you'd kind of expect to, right? The reason for that is because of this down here. This is called the transient loop mode. And so the default setting is this. And what that means is that when it plays through a slice of the audio, so from here to here, for example, if the time stretching is drastic enough, you know, if you slow it down far enough so that in theory there would be spaces between each slice, what's happening is it's taking a portion of that slice, like maybe the back half of it, and it's looping it backwards and forwards continuously to fill in the gap before the next slice happens. So that's why it sounds kind of like garbled and choppy and weird. So we can tell it to loop backwards and forwards. We can tell it to just loop forwards. Or better yet, we can tell it just to play through each slice and stop. Now, if we use this mode, now we hear those gaps. This could be kind of cool, like doing like a reggaeton or reggae sort of thing. You kind of hear there's like a kind of a wobbly sub thing going on this first kick, and you sort of hear that all. You hear it almost like an LFO on like a sub bass or something. That sounds kind of cool, right? So again, we're telling it to slice on the transients, but now we're telling it just play through each of those slices and stop. Don't try to fill out the loop or anything like that. Now, this is actually really nice. If I'm warping something, let's go back to my original tempo here, 170 BPM. If I'm warping something and I'm like, you know what, I got to slow this thing down maybe just a little bit. I'm not going crazy with it, but I just need to slow it down a little bit, maybe like 150. It sounds a little choppy, but it's allowing me to like make each hit of the drum loop sound distinct, and like it hits and there's space between it if I want to. Versus if I leave it on the default setting, I'm starting to get that garbled junk in between each hit, right? So when I warp drum loops, I leave it in beats mode, and I just switch the preserve to this setting here, or leave the preserve on transients, or unless it's like maybe I'll throw another example in of like a really distinct like 16th note hi-hat or shaker or something like that. Something that's like clearly 16th notes or clearly 8th notes. Then maybe I'll switch the preserve to like, you know, whatever, 16ths or 8ths or whatever. Let me see if I can just find like let's look for tops here. Drum loop, top drum loop. Yeah, what do we got? Yeah, something like this, or yeah, maybe that. Let's throw that in on another track here. Let's change the color. Assign track color to clip so they're the same. And then let's look at this one. I'm going to solo this guy for a sec. So this is hitting pretty clearly on 16th notes. So I might go beats mode, preserve 16ths, play through Play through and stop. The original tempo here is 175. I'm slowing it down quite a bit. So I do hear those spaces pretty distinctly. You may or may not want that. But if we go back to like 170, that just sounds a little tighter. Now, the other cool thing we can do with this, the beats mode here, depending on what we set as the preserve setting, we can use this slider here. This is called, it's a weird name. It's called the transient envelope slider. It's a dumb name for, think of it like a, how long each slice plays for control, right? So at 100%, each slice is playing for the full amount from, 1/16th note to the next 16th note, or like over here, one transient to the next transient. Let's actually try it out over here first. But if I bring this down, I'm shortening the length of each slice. So I'm kind of tightening the loop up in a way. So sometimes what I'll do when I'm making, especially drum and bass tracks, when I'm using breakbeat loops and stuff like this all the time, let's play it in context with a little pad here. So I've got this version of the break where I'm, again, warping in beats mode, preserve. I got this play through and stop, but I'm really shortening each slice. But then I'm going to make a duplicate of that clip. We'll call this like tight break. And then maybe I'll call this like extended break or something like that. Not because I'm going to make it longer, but I'll have a version of the clip where I just go back here and I pull the transient envelope up to 100. Now it feels more open. Like I hear the full length of every slice. I hear like the kind of the air and the background noise. Let me also set these. Are these, I think I changed the quantize settings on these. What did I do here? Oh yeah, let me just set those to global. Okay. So like maybe in my intro, I have a few bars of just this really tight break where I'm removing space between each hit. And then when I get into like the drop or something, I kind of open it up. Right now I get the full length of every slice playing. And let's do the same thing here with this. I'll call it shaker. More like a cymbal hit, but whatever. It's super loud, so I'm going to turn that down. Maybe pitch it up a little bit. Let's shorten it. Just tighten it up a little bit. Sounds a little messy with this break because there's a little bit of looseness here, and this is like really on grid, but you get the picture. Let's hear it with the pad. Yeah, like that could be a cool ass intro. And then I have a copy of it where it's just fully open. I could call this closed and open. It's kind of like closed hats and open hats, right? All right, but we can also extend this technique. It doesn't have to just be used on drums, right? Beats mode, you can warp anything with that. Let's take this pad. I got this version of the pad, and it's got a little like LFO movement or something, right? There's kind of this volume thing going on. So there's a bit of movement there. So I'll call this like pad a ridge. I'll duplicate it, and I can call this pad choppy or something like that. And then on this clip, we abuse the beats warp mode. Let's try maybe like an 8th note stutter. I'll just do play through and stop. Shorten the transient envelope. That's cool. Let's check it with our break. $50, 55% sounds cool. And then I can cut back to the original. Make another one, pad choppy too. And do 16th notes, right? Play that one. Yeah, that shaker's a little off. It's, the shaker's too quantized. It's too perfectly on grid. This one's a little bit more loose. So I should actually go in, let's go into this breakbeat and just tighten things up. And by the way, when you're warping stuff, you may notice stuff like this, right? This snare I can see is actually hitting a little bit late. And this snare over here is also hitting a little bit late. So let's tighten those up. So check this out. I'm going to create a warp marker right here. I'm just going to lock it onto the grid. Now, be careful when you do this. This could lead to messiness, but it could also be kind of cool, depending on how you do this. But when I do this, if I create a warp marker and I move it around, notice that everything to the left of it is kind of getting smushed together like an accordion or like spread back out. Everything to the right of it is staying timed out the same, right? Let's tighten this one up as well. Again, stuff in between those two warp markers can be either smushed together or spread out, but everything to the right of that stays timed out the same. So in fact, the way this loop was cut, if I want to tighten up these two snares, there's actually going to be a little bit of empty space at the end of my loop here, but it probably won't matter too much. Let's take a listen. Yeah, there's a little empty space at the end, but it's not a big deal. It sounds like those, cutting out, starting back up again. Let's just do the same thing here. What I'm going to do is actually just copy this clip up. I'm just Option or Alt dragging that up. We'll call this tight break again. And I'll just change my transient envelope. I had it at like 55%, I think. So we get that's the same warp timing, but just that cut up feel again. Now this might sound better with our... Yeah, now that those snares are on, all those kind of hi-hats are more, closer to the grid. So when I play this shaker loop with it, it feels like it's singing together a little bit better. Nice. Okay, cool. Okay, so again, to recap, beats mode, in order to allow us to time stretch, it basically cuts the audio file up. We can determine where it's cutting the audio file up, and we can use this in creative ways to make things maybe sound more choppy or rhythmic, or just to kind of tighten up a drum loop, remove some of the space in between the hits and really just capture the transients, or have versions of our loops that are just fully extended, right? Just the transient envelope is full length, and we hear all the space and the air and stuff in between those hits, right? Let's take another version of my extended break here. Let's call this, I'm going to call it TS1. We're going to do some fun time stretchy stuff with this one. And I want to take a look at these next couple of warp modes, which are very similar to each other. These are tones and texture, okay? In, practical purposes, like if you read the Ableton Live manual, if anybody ever actually does that anymore, what it tells us is that tones is good if you're warping monophonic pitched material. Like let's say you've got a bass loop or something from a sample pack. Tones mode is a nice option to choose for that. What it doesn't tell you, which is the cool thing about tones mode, is that kind of like beats mode, it slices the audio file up in order to allow time stretching without repitching, or repitching without time stretching. But instead of warping, in beats mode, it warps in, either on the transients or like nice even note divisions here. Tones is a granular time stretch, meaning that it's going to chop the audio file up, but it's going to chop it up into tiny little slices called grains. And if you've ever heard of granular synthesis operates on this same principle, taking an audio file, chopping it up into tiny grains and like playing them back in a certain way. And we can determine the size of the grains from here. I don't know exactly how many slices, like how many grains it creates, but just suffice it to say that when we have a higher grain size, we have fatter chunks, like, bigger grains. And so we won't have as many across the audio file. Smaller size is going to give us more grains, but tinier chunks. So let's listen to it with like a really big grain size and just hear how it sounds. It's probably not going to sound all that much different because I'm playing it at a tempo that's kind of close to what it was recorded at. But again, if we start to time stretch, meaning slow the tempo down, we start to hear that choppiness. And if I bring the grain size down, it's more like buzzy and granular sounding. So that's kind of cool. It gives it a different tone, but you might be thinking that's that's cool. I like what it's doing. And I remember the first time I was learning about this stuff, I was like, oh, wow, if I really slow things down, I like what that's doing, but doesn't really like help me if I'm trying to make a track at 170 BPM. I don't want to be slowing my tempo down to 60 BPM or whatever just to get that effect. So that's where this setting down here can be kind of cool. So let's go to this TS1. Let's bring my grain size down. We'll just start at the default setting. Default setting for grain size is 30 to see how that sounds, and then we can adjust it as needed. But down here, we have this BPM box, which I'll explain in a minute. But more importantly, we have this divide by 2 times 2 control. And what this is, if I hit times 2, it's going to take my loop and it's going to time stretch it by a factor of 2. In other words, it's going to double time or half time it, I should say, so that it takes twice as long to play through that sample at this tempo. So let's hit times 2 and let's just play it back. Let me make sure this is, yeah. So check it out. My original loop is 1 bar long. Now that I've hit times 2, I've stretched it out so it's 2 bars long. So it's taking 2 bars of time. It's giving me a little extra time here that I don't need. It's taking 2 bars of time to play through that same sample. So take a listen to this. If I play my metronome, just kind of half timed it. And the nice thing about this is I can work this loop into my track that's at 170 BPM. It's just going to sound half timed, but I'll get the cool time stretchy effect on it, right? So we could do like, you know, we could do like, you know, 7 bars of this or 3 bars of this, and on the 4th bar we do like a little turnaround, 7, and then we just kind of throw that in on the 8th bar to get the time stretchy effect. Okay, let's make another one. We'll duplicate this. We'll call it time stretch. Whoops, time stretch 2, and let's try texture mode. So texture mode is just like, in my opinion, better tones mode. Texture mode is, again, Ableton manual says it's good for warping textural things like white noise, risers, and effect sounds and things like that. Cool, thanks Ableton. That's helpful information, I guess. But really what it's doing is, again, it's just like tones mode. It's doing a granular slice. It's chopping the audio up into thousands of tiny little slices. We can determine the grain size here, but we have an additional control labeled flux, which will randomize the grain size. Think of this like a random LFO that's taking our grain size and just kind of moving it around at random, right? Flux is going to be more noticeable if your grain size is higher because it has more of a range that it can kind of work over. So let's start with a high grain size. Let me go back to the original tempo. So it's 1 bar long with, let's make it an even 1 bar. Let's play it back. So again, if I'm playing at the original tempo or close to it, the changes here, they're minute, but you can't really notice it all that much. But when we start to really time stretch, let's do the times 2. I'm just going to reset these to their defaults. You can double click on any of these controls, by the way, to just reset them to their default values. We'll hit times 2. Now this should be 2 bars long, right? Yeah. Let's get rid of that extra space. Okay, let's play around with these. So that you can start to hear that randomness more if I increase the grain size, and then more flux means more random. I can get a bit messy and weird. A little bit of flux and a low grain size. This is the type of time stretching that you might hear from like an old sampler, like an Akai S900 or something like this. These are these old rack mount samplers, and people loved them. They're like, especially drum and bass, jungle and stuff like that in the 90s. People were using these because they allowed you to time stretch digital audio, and they used a granular time stretch algorithm. There was a plugin several years ago. I don't know if it's still around. I had actually a mentee when I taught at Icon that showed me this. It's called Akaiser, which is like an Akai style. They'd like kind of use the time stretch algorithm from an old Akai sampler, and you can apply that to your audio. But it sounds a lot like this, like texture mode, if you adjust the grain size and the flux a little bit. And it's especially cool too. Like, you know, we've hit the times 2 button once, but you can hit the ×2 button again. Now we're time stretching the heck out of it. So it's 4 bars long and some change. I don't know why it keeps giving me that change there. But take a listen to this. Right, so now it's like really time stretch. This is really fun on vocals too. You know, the old Rasta vocals that you hear in old jungle tunes and stuff. I'll see if we can pull one in before the end here and mess around with it. But this can be cool. Like, for example, okay, we got this TS2. Let's duplicate this. Let's call this TS2 snare. And what I'm going to do is just move my start marker so it starts on a snare. So if I play my main break up here, we can have that we can kind of throw in. And what I might do, just because I'm kind of playing around with these, normally I would do this on my push, but I want you guys to be able to see what I'm doing here with the mouse. I'm going to take all of these clips, and let's go down here. I've selected all the clips. So it says 5 clips are selected. So any changes I make here, if I want to change the warp mode to all of them or whatever, I can do that. But what I want to do is change their quantized settings from here. So what that means is like how quickly they're going to launch. Like when I hit play on them, how quickly are they going to play? The default setting on all these is global. And that means that, and I think I mentioned this last week if you came to my session view workshop last week, but that means that this is the global clip quantization setting up here. If that's set to 1 bar, that means when I hit play on any of these clips, then I hit play on another one, it's going to wait until the next bar ticks along to play it so that it plays in time. So I'm going to play it offbeat. And it blinked for a couple of seconds and then it kind of played, so it plays right in time. But we can change that per clip, right? So I'm going to change this to, maybe we'll do 1/8 notes. That's just going to allow me to like fire these clips off more quickly. And what I might also do is select all the clips. This is kind of a little session view hack, but it can be fun when you've got, you know, copies of a clip with different warp mode settings. I'm going to select all the clips again. I'm going to turn this legato function on. I can't remember if I explained this last week when we were looking at follow actions or not. I think I did, but for those of you who weren't here, what that means now is that if I hit play on one of these clips, the next clip that I play will pick up its playback where that one leaves off. Now that might seem like a mouthful right there. But what that means, for example, like if I hit play on this extended break clip, which is kind of like my main break right now, if I hit play on that, and then I jump down to one of these other ones, it's going to pick up, it's going to start playing right where this one left off. So if this is, you know, if I hit play right before a snare hits, I'll hear this snare. And then when I click back on this one, it'll pick up its playback from where it would have left off. So it's almost like this clip is continuing to loop in the background on mute. And when I hit play on it, it's like I'm crossfading back over to it, if that makes sense. So it's just like continuously flowing in the background. I just got to be faster with my timing. Too slow with my timing. And Zoom is not helping matters. Oh, I also, is this? Okay, it is on. Oh, okay. This one I got to turn off legato. Hold on. Yeah, because I always want that to land on the snare. See, I can like fire that off and then come back to this one. So anyway, you can have some fun like cutting between clips. Like if you're playing live or something, you can have multiple copies of a loop, have different warp modes, have some of them set to legato mode and like cut between them. But anyway, let's look at one more example of this kind of cool granular time stretch trick with the texture mode. I'm going to grab, because we're in the zone right now, we're going to grab some Rasta vocals. So I just YouTube search Rasta vocals. I think I brought this up in a past workshop sometime last year, but there's this free Chrome extension called Sample. And what it allows you to do is just sample anything you play off the internet. So if you're playing videos on YouTube, or if you're on Spotify on your browser or whatever, you can just record anything as audio. So I'm just going to play a little bit of this. It's like, I'm not going to play all of it. What is it? Almost 3 minutes of just random Rasta samples here. Just me no move cartoony, Juni. And if I just open this sample extension, and you can just, if you Google search sample Chrome extension, you can download it and install it into your Google Chrome or whatever browser you use. I use Brave, which is not Google Chrome, obviously, but you can run all the Chrome extensions in it. It'll show up as just a button up here in your browser window, and you just, activate it. You hit this little record button down here, and then you start playing stuff.
Run where your man when name Tony, juicing our belly like tsunami. So when me say, woman, me know your body is your weapon. The way you whine, I know you twerk. The baddest girl in all the world. Bend back where you make me should be in you. Me tired for ear man, not tell me what you can do. Same way you fling it up, me want you fling it for me too. Girl, as fling it up, me want to give it to you.
Stop the playback here. And then if I go back to this, the sample extension, I can go down here and I can just download it. Where's the download button? It's like the window size is all weird. No. There it is. Okay. Download it. Cool. And then I'll go to my downloads folder. Just make sure we got it.
Run where your man when name Tony, juicing bend and do. Same way you fling it up, me want you fling it for me.
Okay, so it saves it as a WAV file. I can drop it into Ableton now. And there it is. And then we can just find bits and pieces that we want. So again, let's play with the different warp modes. I'm going to change the start point. I think over here, I kind of skip back to the beginning of the video when he's just sort of talking.
Bend back where you make me should be in you. Me tired for ear man.
Okay, cool.
Bend back where you make me should be in you.
Let's just start it.
Bend back where you make me should be in you.
There. I can right click and do set 1.1.1 here. Ableton automatically warped it. May or may not be in time with my project here. It probably isn't, but that's okay because we're just going to mess around with time stretching here. So let's try texture mode.
Bend back where you make me.
Let's time stretch it like crazy.
Bend back where you make me should be in you.
That's cool. Like even if we just take that little bit of it, just loop that up. We got our time stretch. Let's play with our settings.
Bend back where you make me. Bend back where you.
Let's play our beat back. Turn him down a little. I'll turn loop off so it doesn't keep looping, and I'll just set the end marker here, maybe like after the first couple of words that he says. Try different time stretch factors. If I hit this divide by 2, it's going to kind of go back a step. So now it's, I think it's double timed. I think or it's like half timed. I had quarter timed it because I hit it twice. If I hit times 2 again, this should be the original tempo now. Which could also be kind of cool. I mean, I'm not getting the time stretchy weirdness, but it's, it's speeding it up in a certain way. This is also cool, this divide by 2 setting here. Maybe I have a loop that is, let's just see if I can find another thing here. Oh, I'm getting the beach ball. No. Okay. Take off the tops. Clear out, yeah. Trying to find something a little slower. That could work. Okay, so let's throw that in, throw it on a new audio track here. Yeah, so I just hit the divide by 2 on that. So that's a slower drum loop, but I'm kind of double timing it with that. I'm kind of tricking Ableton into thinking this is actually recorded slower and I want you to play it fast for me. Beats warp mode, preserve transients, play through and stop. That's kind of a cool additional drum element. Now, the other thing that's fun, especially with drum loops, but again, really with anything, is the next warp mode, which is repitch. Okay, so repitch, it kind of undoes the whole warping concept. So when we have repitch enabled, you notice that the pitch control, we lose it. But what that means is that pitch and playback speed are now connected again, which, you know, the whole point of warping is to sort of get out of that, isn't it? But it can be cool if you're trying to do something where you're like timbrally changing your drums or whatever drum, you know, whatever loops you're bringing in. It doesn't have to be drums. I keep saying drums, but so let me just bring that same loop in again, but without my weird time stretch thing going on here. Let me solo it for a minute. This is what it originally sounded like, right? All this kind of vinyl crackly stuff in the background, which is a little bit annoying, but could be kind of cool. Okay, but if I switch it to repitch mode, got a different tone to it, right? Let's make a copy of it. I'll warp it again in beats mode. It's almost like 2 different pitches because they're playing at 2 different tempos. So when I brought the audio file in, Ableton Live guessed, if we look at this BPM control, and this is kind of important too, especially when you're working with like repitch mode, Ableton Live guessed that the original tempo is 190 BPM. That's not actually correct. You can see in the name of the sample, the original tempo is actually 95. But because I'm playing so fast here, because my project tempo is so fast, Ableton just kind of took a guess and was like, maybe it's double that. So 2 times 95 is 190, right? So it's actually playing it there. But if you notice that, if you bring a loop in and you realize like, whoa, this is playing way faster or way slower than it should be, and you know the tempo because maybe it says it in the name. Let me move this one down just because we're focusing on this one right now. What you can do is just be careful because if you have additional warp markers in here, and let's say I move one, this can change. Right now it doesn't say 190 anymore. It says 164.81. The reason for that is because this is what's called the segment BPM. This is what Ableton thinks the tempo is from one warp marker to the next. And then from this one to the next one, it's going to probably give me a different number if I move this. Yeah. So now it thinks from here to here, the tempo is, what was it? It was like one, or no, it was this one. Yeah, 301.65 BPM, right? So that's all wrong. So if you're doing this, make sure you just have one warp marker in there. Whoops. What did I just do? Click on that warp marker just to select it. So single click on it. And then this is what Ableton thinks the tempo of the entire rest of this audio file is. It thinks it's 190. But if you're noticing that and you're like, no, that sounds like it's way too fast or it's way too slow. I know this was recorded at 95. You can go down to BPM, just type that number in. And actually, look, it cut it right in half. Now it's exactly 1 bar long. Let's listen to it in beats mode. Let me solo it. Stop all this other stuff for a minute. Do my playthrough and stop so it just sounds a little cleaner. So here's a 95 BPM loop playing at 170 in beats mode, right? It's all well and good, whatever. But a 95 BPM loop playing at 170 in repitch mode, check this out. Very different tone. I think that's going to kind of layer in nicely with our other drums. We go back up here. This is where it thought it was 190 BPM, and we're in beats mode. I'll just do the playthrough and stop because I like it. It's not bad, but it feels like I'm trying to force an old hip hop loop into a drum and bass song. This feels like it fits more naturally into what I'm trying to do with this drum and bass / jungle idea, right? So sometimes taking like older, slower samples, putting them in repitch mode if you're, working at a much faster tempo can be really cool because you kind of play around with the timbre or the tone of the loop, whatever it is. Now I'm primarily working with drums here. I'm actually curious if we do this with the pad. I think it's 138.5, and I haven't changed the pitch of the pad. You want to factor that in. If you do adjust the pitch of the some sort of pitch sample or musical sample, this may not work. Because I haven't touched the pitch and I haven't written any other music yet in this track, I'm just trying to spitball ideas and see what sounds cool. Let's take a copy of the pad original here. Let's call it pad repitch. Let's just see if I change the warp mode to repitch mode. That's cool. So if we look at this, again, Ableton thinks the original sample was recorded at 138.56, but I'm playing a lot faster. So when it's warped in repitch mode, it has to pitch it up. Obviously, if you're trying to like pitch something very exactly, don't use repitch mode, use beats mode or complex mode or something like that. Just adjust the pitch like so, because then you can really dial it in, and then you can obviously adjust the playback speed and all that stuff independently. But sometimes if you just, like I'm here starting an idea and I'm not really sure what I want yet, like that sounds kind of cool. Sounds kind of eerie. So maybe my next step would be I'd figure out what the pitch of that is, and then maybe I'd write a bass line and some melodies and stuff around that. And if I wanted to, I could always use last tip of the day here, and then I know we got to wrap up, but I could throw the tuner on it. We'll see if the tuner picks it up. Got an F and a C sharp in there somewhere. I think it's actually playing a chord, so it's probably the tuner's probably not going to pick it up properly. But if we looked at like a spectrum analyzer or something like that, that might be able to see like which pitches are coming out there. It looks like we have a C, a D, an E, and an F. A couple pitches kind of popping up here. We got like a C sharp. I have to like write out the MIDI notes and look at it and try to figure out what chord that is. But yeah, you could use that to kind of determine the pitches that you're hearing in a sample. All right, that was wow, it's already 7:03. Any questions? I know we just like smoked through a lot of material there, but I hope it's giving you some ideas. Some thoughts are bubbling around of how you can maybe use that. Like the texture time stretch is one of my favorite things to mess around with. And sometimes just experimenting with repitch mode. If I'm bringing in a sample that is original recording of it is like much slower or much faster than the tempo I'm working at, sometimes repitch mode can be an interesting way just to hear it like snap to a new pitch. Especially with drums where the pitch doesn't quite matter as much. It just gives you a cool like timbral element or a timbral change on the sound. So think about that. All right, well, if nobody's got anything, I bid you all adieu and go experiment with some warp modes.
Oh yeah. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
No worries. All right, guys, have a good rest of the week.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you. You too.